Number 20. Mihailo Miroshnichenko. During a visit to Neptune Beach, Florida one evening in June 2023, 20-year-old Mihailo Miroshnichenko noticed a man and two children struggling in the water. They were caught in a rip current and being dragged further out to sea, and there were no lifeguards on duty at the time. So Mihailo rushed into the water to try saving them. According to a police report, he made it out to the family and pushed one of the kids toward their dad. The three swimmers eventually made their way to safety, but Mihailo got caught in the riptide. After seeing the young man lying on his back in the water and then vanishing from sight, the father, who just narrowly avoided drowning himself, dialed 911. Crews searched all night for Mihailo, and they found his body at 2:30 a.m., 6 hours after he disappeared. Mihailo, who went by Misha to his loved ones, had recently moved to Jacksonville with his two brothers after fleeing war-torn Ukraine and staying at a refugee camp in Norway. He was deeply devoted to his Christian faith and had a reputation for being kind and sympathetic among those who knew him. His parents and several younger siblings were still in Norway when he drowned, leaving his brothers with the grim task of telling them that he'd passed away. Eric Polite, the father who was saved from the water with his two kids, gave a touching eulogy at the young man's funeral. He said, "My kids call him a hero, but I believe that they're using the wrong word. My mother told me that angels walk among us. Thank you for saving my kids. I'm forever grateful." Mihailo's two brothers told police that he wasn't a strong swimmer, even though he fearlessly entered dangerous waters without a second thought. They said they didn't see him go under the water and that they checked their vehicle to see if he was in it when they couldn't find him. In a statement, police cited the tragedy as a reminder to the public to follow common sense safety rules when it comes to swimming in the Atlantic, like never swimming alone and always staying near a lifeguard. Authorities also urged swimmers to remember that ocean conditions can change rapidly at any time and without warning. A lot of people react on impulse when they see someone in danger, especially when it comes to drowning. But experts warn strongly against jumping into the water without thinking about other possible ways to help someone in distress, especially if you're not a great swimmer. In fact, studies have shown that more people often die trying to rescue victims than they do from the original disaster or emergency. This could easily be explained away by the fact that there are often more rescuers than there are victims. But a closer look at many cases may also show that people often use poor judgment when it comes to deciding if, when, and how to help someone in a dangerous situation. Number 19. Adam Theo. While walking along a busy road in Arlington, Texas one evening in late May 2023, United States Air Force veteran Adam Theo noticed that an argument between a young couple was starting to get out of hand, and as he got closer to the pair, the fight continued to escalate. Theo later told NBC News that a young woman was trying to pull away from a man who was grabbing her shoulders and being slightly aggressive. So he instinctively tried to grab the man's shoulder and pull him away from the woman. The Good Samaritan's decision to intervene was effective in getting the man to take his hands off the female victim, but only because he turned his anger toward Theo and began beating him mercilessly. A bystander named Joseph Scott rushed over to stop the attack while other witnesses dialed 911. Speaking with NBC, Scott said he was super worried about Theo, who was bleeding profusely. The attacker fled the scene as bystanders chased after him, dragging the woman behind him as he ran away. Theo was taken to a local hospital where he received treatment for serious but non-life-threatening injuries. And in a Twitter thread describing the attack in detail, he said he lost count of how many times he'd been hit after 6 punches. Most people would want the suspect to be arrested and punished for the disturbing act of violence. But as a devoted criminal justice reform advocate, Theo didn't think jail was the answer. He told NBC that he'd rather see his attacker get whatever help he needed for his apparent anger problems, and that he thought probation was more appropriate than throwing him behind bars. Police encouraged the public to come forward with information about the suspect and the woman he was with, who still have not been identified. And while Theo's attacker didn't appreciate his attempt to intervene, many others showed their support by donating to a crowdfunding campaign to help him cover expenses during his recovery, which raised over $12,000. Number 18. Tony Steele. Donald Price was out and about in Ossett, England one evening in September 2022 with his friend Tony Steele when he got into an argument with a woman who tried to sell him some salmon he didn't want. The woman, later identified as 52-year-old Lorraine Hargreaves, left a caravan park where she was selling the meat and returned 10 minutes later with 45-year-old Christopher Donaldson and 39-year-old Anthony Sladek. The trio then assaulted Price, punching him repeatedly in the face, and stole his bank card during the altercation. When Price noticed that his bank card was missing several hours later, Steele and another friend offered to accompany him to Hargreaves' house to try getting it back. Another altercation broke out on the home's doorstep between the three men and their three adversaries from earlier that day, and someone stabbed Steele during the confrontation. Price and his friends fled the scene, and Sladek and Donaldson briefly chased after them before Donaldson was seen dropping the knife onto the grass. And as a result, Steele suffered fatal stab wounds to the neck, chest, and upper back. Authorities arrested Sladek, Donaldson, and Hargreaves in connection with his death. Donaldson was found guilty of murder, assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and causing grievous bodily harm with intent. And for his crimes, he was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Sladek was convicted of manslaughter, along with the same assault and bodily harm charges that Donaldson was found guilty of. He received a prison sentence of 11.5 years, while Hargreaves was sentenced to 3 years behind bars for common assault occasioning actual bodily harm, and theft. Number 17. THIERRY Bastien. While shopping at a Walmart store in Lauderdale Lakes, Florida with his girlfriend and kids one afternoon in 2023, 41-year-old THIERRY Bastien saw a fight break out between a female employee and a young man. It started with an argument in the store's frozen food section and quickly escalated into a physical altercation. The young man, later identified as an off-duty employee named Tyrone Shavar Sterling, dropped a 9mm handgun on the floor as he tried to grab the woman's phone out of her hand. He was demanding to see her text messages, but she refused to hand over the phone. At that point, push literally came to shove, as Sterling allegedly slammed the woman into some shelves. She yelled out for help, but none of her co-workers were coming to her aid, so Bastien attempted to intervene. Instead of diffusing the situation, however, his involvement quickly turned him into Sterling's new target. In a completely unwarranted overreaction to Bastien's attempt to split up the fight, Sterling allegedly picked his handgun up off the floor and fired 10 rounds at him, striking him 6 times in the chest, back, and lower body. Bastien's girlfriend, Makia Ford, told the local 10 News station that she pleaded with Sterling to let her boyfriend live after he fired the first shot. But she said that he continued to mercilessly pull the trigger as he stood over Bastien. Ford described her boyfriend as a hero with a big heart. He didn't deserve what happened to him, and as Ford put it, it's unfair to her or the couple's kids, who now have to carry on without him. Sterling fled the scene, but was apprehended later that day at a nearby apartment complex. He faces 1 count each of first-degree murder and armed robbery by sudden snatching, and is being held without bail at the Broward County Jail. At just 22 years old, he could very well be looking at spending the rest of his days behind bars, if convicted of the charges. Number 16. Anthony Watts. When Pastor Anthony Watts noticed a wrecked motorcycle along a highway in Jackson, Mississippi one evening in April 2023, he stopped to assist the stranded rider. But the biker didn't want the 61-year-old's help. He wanted Anthony's pickup truck. So he shot Watts repeatedly and left him to die along the roadside while he sped off in the Good Samaritan's vehicle. By the time officers responded to the scene, Watts had succumbed to his injuries. Just 2 nights earlier, 4 detainees had escaped from the Raymond Detention Center near Jackson by breaching a cell in the facility's roof. Authorities believe that Casey Grayson, Corey Harrison, Jerry Rains, and Dylan Arrington may have camped out on top of the building before splitting up and going their separate ways. At the time, the men were being held on various felony charges, mostly revolving around theft, but they hadn't been convicted of the allegations. Investigators from the Hinds County Sheriff's Office suspected that the man who killed Watt may have been one of the escaped inmates. He reportedly matched the description of 22-year-old Dylan Arrington, who'd been locked up on charges of auto theft and gun possession. It wasn't Arrington's first rodeo with the law. He'd previously been convicted of auto theft in 2020 and was sentenced to serve 2 years behind bars. But while out on parole a year later, he allegedly stole another car. Arrington posted a $10,000 bond and was freed in early 2022, only to be accused of stealing yet another vehicle just 3 months later. A few weeks after that, investigators found 3 guns in his house and hauled him back to jail, where he remained until his escape in 2023. 2 days after Watt's murder, authorities tracked Arrington down at a home south of Jackson in Leake County. The homeowner had seen him lurking around near the house. And after recognizing Arrington as one of the fugitives, he packed up his family and left. The next morning, the homeowner returned to the property and discovered Arrington inside. Luckily, though, deputies were already in the driveway. Arrington, refusing to face the music, barricaded himself inside the residence. A standoff ensued, and the escaped prisoner set the house on fire after exchanging gunfire with deputies and shooting one of them in the leg. Thankfully, the deputy survived and was transported to the hospital in a stable condition. Authorities waited for the fire to burn out before entering the destroyed home and finding Arrington's charred remains. Although his death meant that he'd never face justice in the court of law for his actions, law enforcement officials seemed glad that Arrington would never shoot another cop, kill another innocent civilian, or terrorize an entire community ever again. The remaining 3 escaped victims were all recaptured within a week of Arrington's death and were sent right back to jail. Number 15. An unappreciated helping hand. While walking along a street in Knoxville, Tennessee one afternoon in August 2022, Thomas Martin was approached by a homeless man who asked for money to buy food. Martin offered to buy a meal for the man, who was later identified as John Bass, and the two proceeded toward a nearby McDonald's restaurant. As they were walking, Bass allegedly struck Miller across the face with a pipe and stole $35 from him. He ran off, and responding officers arrived to find Miller suffering from several severe cuts on his face. They tracked Bass down at a nearby KFC restaurant, where they noticed blood on his hands, and they arrested him on suspicion of aggravated robbery. Just weeks later, a university student's attempt to buy food for a homeless person in the neighboring state of Georgia went wrong in a much different way. Joe Ortega was picking up a DoorDash order at a Popeyes restaurant in Atlanta when she noticed a hungry-looking man outside. She offered to buy him food, but when she tried to purchase some chicken for him at the drive-thru, an employee refused to take the order. Ortega took her phone out and began recording the conversation as she asked the worker why she wasn't allowed to purchase food for the man. An employee who noticed they were being recorded made a remark about how they didn't care that they were being filmed and shut the drive-thru window as Ortega asked for their name. The kind young woman was in utter disbelief over the situation, but she was even more blown away when the police showed up. In a series of TikTok videos about the incident, Ortega said that she was scared she was going to be arrested. Atlanta police confirmed to Fox 5 Atlanta that they responded to a call about a woman who allegedly refused to leave the Popeyes drive-thru. But Ortega didn't break any laws, so no arrests were made. In fact, Ortega claimed that a responding officer pulled her aside and commended her for her generosity. She said the cop thanked her for buying food for someone in need. The homeless man, whose name is Jazz, could be seen holding a Popeyes cup in a follow-up video, so thankfully it appears as though he got something to eat after all. But Ortega's kindness didn't stop there. She started an online fundraiser to help Jazz replace his broken tent, and if possible, to perhaps get him into a more permanent housing arrangement. On the page, she described the incident outside Popeyes, writing, "Oftentimes homeless people are treated like stray animals. If you feed them, they're going to keep coming back." But Ortega said, "I believe that people deserve to be treated like people." The campaign has raised over $4,000 so far, which undoubtedly has gone a long way to improving Jazz's situation, but donations are still being collected for the cause. Number 14. Kenneth Vineyard. 48-year-old single father Kenneth Vineyard and his fiancée Marcy Beatty were at a Walmart store in Monica, Pennsylvania in November 2022 when they witnessed a shooting in the parking lot. Vineyard rushed over to the victim and rendered aid until paramedics arrived. Off-duty Center Township police officer John Hawk approached Vineyard and allegedly ordered him to step away from the victim. But when Vineyard tried to explain that he was just trying to help and that he was trying to get back over to Beatty, who was nearby, Hawk once again ordered him to step away from the victim. He then allegedly shoved the Good Samaritan to the ground. Vineyard hit his head on the pavement, had a seizure, and fell unconscious. After detecting no pulse, Beatty attempted CPR, but failed to revive Vineyard. And unfortunately, he died from his injuries at a nearby hospital, leaving behind a young son. From the get-go, Vineyard's loved ones were convinced that Hawk had murdered him and that the off-duty officer deserved to be criminally charged. Footage of the disturbing incident appeared to show Hawk violently pushing Vineyard and then falling on top of him. The family demanded justice, but encountered one roadblock after another in their attempts to convince authorities to charge Hawk with murder. Beaver County District Attorney David Lozier recused himself from the case due to a conflict of interest, and it fell onto the State Attorney General's desk. In the meantime, Vineyard's loved ones filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Center Township and Officer Hawk. The family's attorney, Joel Sanson, said that the lawsuit aimed to prove that Hawk murdered Vineyard and that local officials knew Hawk was a bad cop with a history of violating people's constitutional rights. Sanson accused the town of failing to properly train, supervise, and discipline Hawk, and he even went as far as saying that Vineyard might still be alive if it weren't for these shortcomings. In the end, the case was settled for $950,000, which went into Kenneth Vineyard's estate. His death was ultimately ruled an accident resulting from hypertension and a plaque build-up in his arteries. But the medical examiner concluded that the blunt force trauma Vineyard experienced during his fall and the stress associated with the confrontation contributed to his death. However, authorities declined to press charges against Hawk. The decision to forego a criminal case obviously came as a major blow to Vineyard's family, who continue to stand by their belief that he was murdered. A Change.org petition pushing for charges against Hawk argues that Vineyard was killed while acting under Good Samaritan law, which is meant to protect civilians who step in and help someone they believe is hurt, sick, incapacitated, or otherwise in peril. For now, however, authorities have made their decision, and they have no apparent plans to consider criminal charges. Number 13. Linda Robson. While driving to a Walmart store in Chester County, South Carolina in August 2021, 63-year-old Linda Robinson spotted a couple stranded on a roadside with their broken-down car. So she pulled over and offered a ride to the pair, who were later identified as Amber Nicole Harris and George Linwood Fail. Then later that morning, a body thought to be Robinson's was found dead on the side of a road. After learning that the grandmother was last seen at Walmart, investigators reviewed surveillance footage from inside the store, and based on the video, they confirmed that the recently discovered body belonged to Robinson. The footage revealed that Harris and Fail waited inside the senior citizen's minivan while she went inside the store to fill a prescription. Police found Robinson's minivan abandoned on the side of a road later that evening. According to detectives, Harris and Fail asked Robinson to drive them to a specific road where Fail beat her to death. The couple then allegedly discarded her body like trash and drove off in her minivan. Chester County Sheriff Max Dorsey said that Robinson helped a lot of people before she crossed paths with the wrong two and paid for it with her life. He spoke of the suspects in less favorable terms, describing Fail as a known meth user who'd been in and out of jail at least 6 times. Amber Nicole Harris had an even lengthier rap sheet, which included 36 prison stints. And at the time of Robinson's murder, the pair were both out on bond after being arrested on drug charges just weeks earlier. Sheriff Dorsey said that he believed they were both high on meth when they allegedly killed Robinson. The couple were arrested the day after the homicide, and thankfully, they've been behind bars at the Chester County Jail ever since while awaiting trial. Harris stands accused of murder, carjacking, and probation violation. She requested bond early on in the case but was denied, then requested it again in March 2023. During a hearing on the matter, Robinson's husband of 44 years, Vernon Robinson, and her daughter spoke about why they thought Harris needed to remain behind bars. Prosecutors also argued their case, describing Harris as a flight risk and a danger to the community, and in the end, the judge denied the bond request. Fail faces 1 count each of murder, carjacking, and a 3rd charge for throwing bodily fluids on a cop, prison employee, or visitor. At this point, Linda's loved ones have been waiting for 2 years for the defendants to go to trial, and they're ready to get it over with. As the cases continue to drag their heels through the court system, the family is getting increasingly frustrated. During an interview with local station WSOC-TV, Vernon urged people to keep a protective watch over their family. He'd admittedly just learned the hard way that people often think something as horrific as a murder of a loved one could never happen in their family, when it's entirely possible. Number 12. Alan Geddes. During an evening out in Aberdeen, Scotland in 2019, 56-year-old Alan Geddes met a 33-year-old man named Stuart Quinn, who'd just been released from prison that day and had nowhere to stay. Geddes offered to pay for a hotel room for Quinn, but the hotel was fully booked, so he invited Quinn to spend the night at his home. Early the next morning, Geddes was discovered dead at the bottom of his staircase with more than 40 stab wounds to his body. Quinn was found at the scene with the knife in his hand and admitted to being the killer. He was charged and ultimately convicted of Geddes' murder and was sentenced to a minimum of 18 years in prison. After investigating the disturbing case, Scotland's Mental Welfare Commission released a damning report revealing multiple systemic shortcomings that contributed to Geddes' death. According to the findings, Quinn had a troubling psychiatric history, which included 4 hospitalizations throughout 2018. And during that time, he was diagnosed with drug-induced psychosis. He also apparently suffered from paranoid delusions. On one occasion, Quinn was involuntarily detained under the country's Mental Health Act after entering his neighbor's flat with a screwdriver in his hand. Even his family members expressed concerns about his behavior, but psychiatrists concluded that he didn't have a mental illness and released him. Quinn spent most of 2019 in jail. He was released in September after spending more than 4 months behind bars, with a comprehensive support plan in place to hopefully prevent him from any more run-ins with the law. But unfortunately, he almost immediately reoffended and was taken back to jail. He was unexpectedly released again in December, this time with no living arrangement or other supportive resources in place. Simply put, Quinn was dumped back onto the street and left to his own devices, despite his obvious need for close supervision and mental health treatment. Within hours of his release, Quinn was using cocaine and on the fast track to his next violent offense. The Mental Welfare Commission's report concluded that even though having a support plan in place failed to stop Quinn from reoffending after his September release, it may have prevented Geddes' death following his subsequent release 3 months later. In the words of Parliament member Douglas Lumsden, Geddes died because he stepped in where others had failed, including the country's prison aftercare system. The report recommended several changes to healthcare officials and the government for preventing this type of needless tragedy from happening again. A government spokesperson said that the administration would carefully consider the report before responding at length. The Scottish Prison Service then reassured the public of its commitment to supporting recently released inmates as they re-enter society. Geddes' sister Sandra was outraged by the cataclysmic failures that enabled Quinn to slip through the cracks of the system without the proper level of care or oversight. She told the Scottish Sun in 2023 that if Quinn had been given a place to stay upon his release, she believes her brother would still be alive today. In Sandra's words, the alarm bells were ringing over Quinn, but they were ignored. She doesn't want anyone else to go through the pain her family has experienced and has become a vocal advocate for improved regulations and guidelines for keeping violent and high-risk individuals locked up until they're truly safe to live among the public. Number 11. Tiffany Dawn Kelly. One afternoon in September 2018, a young couple approached a 29-year-old wife and mother named Tiffany Kelly outside a Dollar General store in Huntsville, Alabama, and asked her for a ride across town. She agreed, but said that she needed to stop at her house nearby to grab her ID and pick up her husband before taking the pair to their destination. But unfortunately, Kelly never made it home. She was found stabbed to death in the road later that day, less than a mile away from the Dollar General store. Her car, however, was nowhere to be found. The first major break in the case came when a resident living 250 miles away in Clark County contacted law enforcement to report a suspected kidnapping. His cousin, 20-year-old Xavier Scott, and a young woman named Dominic Jackson had shown up at his house that day, just hours after Kelly's murder. The couple got into an argument while they were there, leading the concerned relative to suspect that Scott was forcing Jackson to travel with him against her will. Around the same time, Scott's cousin realized that the license plate on the vehicle the couple showed up in matched Kelly's license plate number, which was being broadcast in news reports about her murder. To add to the suspicion, Scott and Jackson had cleaned out the car while they were at the cousin's home, and they allegedly tried to burn some items that law enforcement later identified as evidence connected to Kelly's murder. As it turned out, Jackson wasn't a kidnapping victim. She'd run away from her home in Clark County about 2 weeks earlier and had hitchhiked to Huntsville with Scott. While there, the couple bounced around from one place to another until they ran out of money, at which point they decided they wanted to return home. But they had no way to get there, so they allegedly hatched a plot to steal a car, and Kelly was their unfortunate victim. Authorities said that they found the murder weapon at Scott's cousin's house, along with obvious signs of blood inside Kelly's car. According to police, Scott and Jackson both vaguely admitted to being involved in the murder, but pointed the finger at one another as the actual killer, and as a result, they were both charged with capital murder. During Dominic Jackson's trial in 2022, Scott took the stand and testified that he killed Kelly. The jury acquitted the young woman of murder but found her guilty of robbery. She nevertheless received a life sentence. Jackson will be eligible for parole at some point, but it's unclear when. Xavier Scott finally went to trial in early May 2023, only for the judge to declare a mistrial on the second day of proceedings. The decision came after the topic of Scott being violent toward Jackson was brought up, despite being barred from testimony. After numerous delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic and other issues, Kelly's family was finally looking forward to getting the trial over with so they could close a painful chapter that they'd been forced to live in for nearly 5 years by that point. Scott's case remains unresolved, and unfortunately, it's unclear whether a new trial has been scheduled. Number 10. Michael Urioste. On what started out as a normal Saturday in February 2023, an angry customer later identified as 58-year-old Eric Ford entered a Circle K gas station in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and began causing a scene. A female employee told Ford to stop yelling and asked him to leave the property, but he continued to yell in the gas station parking lot, prompting the clerk to go outside and once again ask him to leave. Ford allegedly punched the worker, and a nearby customer named Michael Urioste intervened. According to witnesses, Urioste asked Ford if he'd hit the employee, and Ford admitted that he had. Urioste told Ford that he shouldn't hit women, and their disagreement quickly became physical. Bystanders later claimed that Ford hit Urioste first, and that the pair were soon wrestling on the ground near a gas pump as a crowd of shocked onlookers gathered around. Witnesses also said that Ford's wife, Rosalind Lee, got out of her car and started hitting Urioste with a cane. The scuffle took a deadly turn when someone pulled a gun and fired multiple shots. Urioste was fatally struck in the abdomen, while another bullet hit a man near the groin while he filled his car with gas, causing non-life-threatening injuries. Eric Ford and Rosalind Lee fled the scene, but it wasn't long before investigators caught up with the couple at a local motel they were staying at. During questioning, Ford allegedly denied having a gun, even though a firearm was found in his motel room. Law enforcement also relied on surveillance footage, cell phone video, and witness reports in identifying Ford as their main suspect. Authorities charged Ford with open murder, which means that if a jury decides to convict, they'll get to decide whether the crime qualifies as first, second, or third-degree murder. He was also charged with 1 count of tampering with evidence. Police concluded that Rosalind Lee's actions during the gas station fight enabled Ford to shoot Urioste. She is also accused of telling her husband to shoot a man who was fleeing the scene right after the shooting. Lee was charged with murder and aggravated assault. And now Ford is currently being held without bond as he awaits trial. Number 9. Jose Antonio Jimenez Quinones. After getting into a fender bender with his mother's car in August of 2022, 22-year-old Marco Jimenez called his father, 52-year-old Jose Jimenez Quinones, and they fixed the vehicle together. Jimenez Quinones didn't help Marco just because he needed it, but because he truly enjoyed helping people. So when he witnessed a car crash during his drive home from work in Gaston County, North Carolina a few days later, it was only natural for him to pull over and see if anyone needed help. In what can only be described as a truly undeserved act of senseless violence, someone at the scene pulled a gun and fatally shot the Good Samaritan. Multiple witnesses told 911 dispatchers that they saw two people exiting the disabled vehicle and fleeing on foot. One caller saw two men run from the scene and get into a minivan. Although it's unclear whether they were the same two men, the other callers reported seeing. The caller followed the minivan to a local residence and shared the address with law enforcement. At least one person reported seeing Jimenez Quinones get shot in the back while trying to open the door to a disabled vehicle at the scene. Authorities have released few details about what exactly happened regarding both the accident and the shooting. The situation was clearly chaotic, but the full story remains unclear. Witnesses have reported as many as 4 cars being involved and at least one of the vehicles fleeing the scene. The murder left the beloved family man's wife and kids both shocked and confused because they knew Jimenez Quinones would never give someone a reason to hurt or kill him. Speaking with Channel 9's Ken Lemon, Marco said that he knew his father was only trying to help, and he told the Gaston Gazette that he wasn't surprised when authorities charged a teenager in connection with the crime, given its senseless nature. The alleged shooter, Tyron Deshaun Dudley, faces 1 count of second-degree murder. When asked whether he felt the charge was justified, Marco told the Gazette that he thinks the accused killer deserves all the suffering he receives in life because he earned it. But for now, Dudley remains innocent under the eyes of the law, and the case is ongoing. Number 8. Javier Leiva. Anytime he was able to, 44-year-old father of 3 Javier Leiva was quick to lend a helping hand to those in need, including complete strangers. So when he saw a Hyundai SUV with a flat tire along a Houston freeway one day in March 2023, he did what he'd normally do and pulled over to help the driver. As Leiva approached the motorist to ask if they wanted him to change their tire, an unknown vehicle rear-ended a Toyota Corolla, which crashed into the Hyundai, Leiva's pickup truck, and the Good Samaritan himself. The unidentified vehicle fled the scene, and Leiva died from his injuries. Speaking with Click 2 Houston after the tragedy, the victim's daughter, Jessica, described her father as kind and selfless. Both she and Leiva's brother, Oscar, said that whenever he saw someone in a bind, it was in his nature to immediately see if he could do anything to help. He knew how to change a car tire, and that it would only take a few minutes out of his day, so when he saw the stranded Hyundai driver, it was a no-brainer to stop and offer his assistance. Houston Police Sergeant David Rose told the news outlet that it's extremely dangerous for motorists to pull over along the freeway. He said that anytime people are uninjured and capable of getting off the freeway after a minor accident, they should. The hit-and-run driver who hit Leiva remains at large. Almost no identifying details are known about the person, including what kind of vehicle they drive or what the suspect themselves looks like. Houston police are in desperate need of help from anyone who might be able to help identify the suspect and have offered a $5,000 reward in exchange for information leading to an arrest in the case. During her interview with Click 2 Houston, Jessica Leiva issued a statement to the driver, reminding them that if a similar tragedy happened in their family, they'd be just as destroyed as the victim's loved ones are. She implored the suspect to do the right thing and come forward, and for anyone with information to share what they know with law enforcement. Number 7. Jacob Farley. During a Friday night swim with some friends in Missouri's Elk River in 2019, 21-year-old Madison Capps got swept away by a hydraulic current that kept pulling her underwater near a dam, and all she had to help her stay above the surface was a small float. A 26-year-old stranger named Jacob Farley, who was passing through on a float tour with another group, saw the young woman struggling and dove into the water to try rescuing her. But he also got sucked into the current, trapping them both in the churning waters. Farley helped Madison stay above water for the next half hour while they awaited rescue, even as he fought to stay alive himself. When emergency responders finally arrived, Madison was able to grab onto a rope that they threw out into the water. She was pulled to safety, but Farley got dragged underwater and drowned, leaving behind a young son. Madison told Fox 43 that having Farley there to comfort her and help her fight to stay alive made a difference in her survival. She said she didn't think she'd have made it if he hadn't been there, and she credited him with saving her life. In addition to being grateful, Madison said she felt guilty because Farley wouldn't have gotten stuck himself if she hadn't gotten trapped. And since she never got a chance to know the hero who saved her life, she learned about him from his family and friends, and she made sure they knew that she'd never forget the sacrifice he made. Number 6. James Nichol. 41-year-old James Nichol and his partner were crossing a bridge over the River Liffey in Dublin, Ireland on Easter morning in 2023 when he saw a man struggling in the river. He was in urgent need of help, and as a former soldier who'd served in the military during the early 2000s, he thought he was a strong enough swimmer to rescue the man. People tried to talk Nichol out of jumping into the freezing cold water, and in addition to the fact that he was about to do something dangerous to begin with, it was 1:30 a.m. and far from sunrise. But he took the plunge anyway. Nichol had unfortunately either overestimated his swimming abilities, underestimated the strength of the river's current, or both. And as he tried to reach the man he jumped in to save, someone alerted nearby police that there were 2 men struggling in the river. By the time the officers arrived at the scene, however, both Nichol and the other man had vanished from sight. And sadly, their bodies were found later that morning. Nichol's sister, Deborah, told RTE Liveline that her brother had gotten sober after struggling with addiction. He was awaiting housing when he unexpectedly lost his life. Deborah described Nichol as a funny, witty, kind soul who was full of life. He was also remembered for the selfless bravery he showed in his attempts to rescue a complete stranger during his last moments on Earth. Number 5. John Irius. In an alarming encounter that was captured on camera in 2023, a girl was walking to school one morning in Los Angeles when a homeless woman approached and attacked her for no apparent reason. The woman struck the victim in the face and wrestled her to the ground while shouting racial slurs. After noticing what was happening, a bystander named John Irius sprang into action without a second thought. He rushed over to the scene and was slashed in the nose with a box cutter while trying to push the attacker off the victim. Despite his injury, Irius managed to free the victim, who continued on her walk to school, and he held the woman down until law enforcement arrived. Irius was running late on his way to meet his friend, Victor Camarena, after losing his car keys and getting delayed, which is the only reason he arrived in the area when he did. Camarena, who's a trained EMT, showed up during the altercation to find Irius with blood gushing from his face. He then rushed over to help detain the woman and call 911. Once he was able to, Camarena administered first aid to Irius while waiting for paramedics to arrive. The laceration that Irius received likely hurt, but it was a small price to pay for making sure the victim was safe. He told local station Fox 11 that he immediately thought of his own daughter when he saw the incident unfolding in front of him, and that it was what prompted him to take action. Irius said that the attack appeared to be a random hate crime triggered by racism, and that he was glad he was there to help. Number 4. Kenneth Salazar. 57-year-old Kenneth Salazar was a Gulf War veteran, cancer survivor, happily married husband, and proud grandfather from San Antonio, Texas, who enjoyed working on cars and motorcycles. He was also happy to help someone in need, so when a stranger required help fixing their car outside a motel one day in July 2021, Salazar didn't think twice about saying yes. While he was working on the vehicle, he got into an argument with a man in the motel's parking lot. During the disagreement, the stranger threatened to shoot Salazar, and he eventually pulled a gun and made good on his word. The shooter fled the scene with a woman in a red vehicle, and Salazar was taken to the hospital with what doctors initially believed was a non-life-threatening gunshot wound to the abdomen. His condition unexpectedly deteriorated over the next 3 days, and sadly, he died from his injuries. Inside one of the motel rooms, investigators found a cell phone and fingerprints belonging to 37-year-old Leopoldo Mora. 2 witnesses and an anonymous tipster implicated Mora in the shooting, and surveillance footage of the crime also put him at the scene. Authorities tracked the suspect down at his apartment and arrested him on suspicion of murder and a parole violation. And in the end, a jury found Mora guilty of Salazar's murder in early 2023 after deliberating for just 1 hour. For his reckless actions, he was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Number 3. Gary Arellano. When 63-year-old Gary Arellano saw 2 teenage girls beating each other up at a park in Denver, Colorado in April 2022, he attempted to break up the fight. But sadly, he was shot to death by a bystander. A witness followed the alleged shooter as he left a park and tipped police off to the suspect's whereabouts. Authorities charged 24-year-old TIFFANY Smith, the boyfriend of one of the girls involved in the fight, with first-degree murder. Arellano's nephew, Aiden, told 9 News that his uncle visited La Alma Park every single day with the same group of friends. According to him, it was his favorite hangout spot. Aiden described Arellano as a positive, outgoing and helpful person who cared about his community. The events that led to the Good Samaritan's death began earlier that day when the 2 young women got into a fight in downtown Denver. Later on, they agreed over text message to meet back up at the park and duke it out for a second time. Speaking with Fox 31, Arellano's sister-in-law Tracy Glassman Arellano called for an end to gun violence and the needless tragedies that come along with it. 3 months after Gary's death, his family and the community dedicated a bench in his honor at the park. Number 2. ELISE Chambellanт. Just weeks before she was due to compete in the Miss Universe Australia pageant final in 2016, 20-year-old ELISE Chambellanт was viciously attacked while trying to break up a fight in a nightclub bathroom. The incident happened during the early morning hours at a club in Queensland, where Chambellanт saw an altercation going on between 2 groups of women and tried to intervene. Her intention was to defuse the situation, but the exact opposite happened. In what Chambellanт later described as an unprovoked assault, 4 of the women beat her in the face and head, yanking handfuls of her hair out of her scalp as the trained martial artist tried to defend herself. A man who overheard the fight eventually entered the bathroom and pulled Chambellanт away from her attackers. She was taken to the hospital, where she underwent 8 hours of x-rays to see if her bones were injured. Luckily, nothing was broken, but the young woman suffered from multiple painful and visible injuries, including black eyes, a busted lip, whiplash, a mild concussion, and multiple soft spots and sores on her head where she'd been beaten. She also had bald spots where chunks of her hair had been ripped out. In a social media post, Chambellanт said that she was angry and disgusted by her attacker's behavior, wondering, is this a type of society we have become? She further questioned, do we not all yet understand that this is how people die? And how many more young lives with huge potential and so many loved ones will be lost to this horrendous behavior? Chambellanт may have lost a physical fight, but she administered one verbal jab after another, describing her attackers and people like them as having a pathetic, spineless, entitled attitude. She vowed to remain vocal about the matter and said that she refused to sweep it under the rug or stand by and watch as innocent people fall victim to senseless acts of violence. Number 1. Casey Rivera. While driving his children home from school in Rockland, California in May 2023, 41-year-old father of 2, Casey Rivera, spotted a family of ducks trying to cross a busy intersection. Worried for their safety, he parked his car and went to guide the ducks across. Rivera had just finished shooing them to the other side of the road and was on his way back to his car when a vehicle appeared out of nowhere and slammed into him, and he died at the scene despite paramedics' best efforts to save him. The teenage driver who hit him remained at the crash site while authorities investigated the incident. It was a sad situation from every angle, according to community member Diane Meyerson, who shared her thoughts with local station KXTV. A man was killed while performing an act of kindness, and 2 lives were ruined. On a fundraising page to help the surviving family members with expenses, Rivera's aunt Tracy described how his final compassionate act in the world was a true reflection of the kind of person he was. A witness told local station KCRA3 that bystanders were clapping as Rivera shepherded the mother duck and her ducklings across the road before the heartwarming moment turned tragic. According to the most recent updates on the case, the investigation into the heartbreaking accident is ongoing. A Placer County Sheriff spokesperson told NBC News that the young driver who struck Rivara was cooperating with authorities and likely won't face criminal charges. If you had to choose, would you rather try to save someone from drowning in a river or rescue someone from a house fire? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below, and if you liked this video, be sure to subscribe. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.